we have an example of a Rhonda. Rhonda asked for the accommodation of a flexible schedule while she adjusts to new medication. She's having difficulty sleeping and waking up and has been late 3 days in a row. She's kind of wary of disclosing her medical condition, but she doesn't want to get into disciplinary action. So Rhonda discloses and provides medical documentation. Since her work doesn't depend on or affect others, her employer found no hardship in flexing her schedule as long as she gets her time in between the core business hours of 8 and 6 p.m. Now, if you're a school teacher and you need to be at work at 8 o'clock, you probably can't come in at 9. That's not going to work. It depends on the job. But for Rhonda in this job, that accommodation worked. So here we have an example of privileges or benefits of employment. And here we have Pete, and Pete has difficulty attending large meetings where there are distractions caused by many people and lots of noise. So allowing Pete to attend meetings by phone conferencing might be necessary to provide him with the same benefits of the information gained from the meetings that everyone else has access to, but it's in a more controlled way that works for Pete and allows him to get that information. And in this situation, this is maybe an unusual circumstance, and these are all real examples. We talk to so many people that we have really a good amount of examples, situations, and solutions to pull from. Here we have Brody, and Brody had difficulty making and sustaining eye contact and had developed a habit of sliding his eyes down to a coworker's chest area while talking with them. Female coworkers thought that this was highly inappropriate. And so the employer decided, hey, let's look at providing a mentor to guide him with personal and social skills. So they worked on practicing that Brody would look at an alternative location, such as a coworker's ear when he couldn't maintain eye contact while talking with a coworker. And that way, his eye contact was a little more proximate to eye contact, and it wasn't offensive to anyone. So how do you disclose? So if you're going to disclose, you must let your employer know that an adjustment or change at work is needed for a reason related to a medical condition. And that reason related to a medical condition is important because you can go to your employer and say, hey, I'm going to need to start coming into work a little bit later. Okay, your employer's like, oh, okay, what does that mean? Are you up too late? Are you out running around? Are you playing video games? What are you doing? And so another way to do that, to really help the employer know, is to say, hey, I'm taking some medication and I have difficulty sleeping because of a medical condition. So I'm going to need to have a flexible schedule. Could we talk about that? It can be as simple as saying it like that. Now, to request an accommodation, you can use plain English. You don't have to use fancy words. You don't have to mention the ADA. You don't have to say reasonable accommodation. You can certainly do that, and then it's clear to the employer what you're asking for. You can, in verbally or in writing, you can tell your employer, your supervisor, a staff member, an HR representative, human resources, or another appropriate person. And we recommend doing so in writing. Under the ADA, you're not required to put any kind of a request in writing. But we suggest that you do that. It's a really good idea to have that documentation that, I disclosed to my employer on January 12th, I told him this information and I have documentation of that. Some employers have their own forms. And so you'll have to get a form and you and your doctor will fill that out. Some people don't want their supervisor to know about their medical condition, and that's okay. The supervisor doesn't have to know. Mostly things should go through the human resources department. Now, if you're going to need an accommodation, say, like an adjusted schedule, I keep going back to an adjusted schedule. There are lots of others, and we'll talk about those. But if you're going to need an adjusted schedule, your supervisor is going to need to know that. They don't need to know why, but they are going to need to know if you're going to start coming in at 9 and work until 6 instead of 8 to 5. So the supervisor will be involved in the accommodation process, just not necessarily in knowing the details of your medical information, because that's highly confidential. And you'll need documentation of a disability when the disability is not obvious or when the need for accommodations are not obvious. And with a lot of people who are neurodiverse, a lot of those need for accommodations, it's not going to be obvious. And that's why the employer can require the medical documentation. And so here, the documentation includes the impairment, the major life activity substantially limited. And we talked about that earlier. Caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating. There's a whole list there, and that is not complete at all. Thinking, communicating, working. And then the major bodily functions include, but are not limited to, normal cell growth. Before, cancer wasn't included as a disability, and now normal cell growth is a major life activity. So if your cell growth is not normal because you have cancer, then that certainly can be a disability. And then again, neurological, respiratory, endocrine, reproductive functions are major life activities as well. So here we have Rico. Rico is a longtime university IT employee, and that's information technology employee, who disclosed how his disability had affected his ability to work the night shift. He requested his shift be changed to a day or evening one to help him better regulate his sleep. His manager is surprised because Rico has had no performance problems or issues of any kind. And we find that a lot of times. People are working and they can work with their disability, and then something about their disability changes or something about their job changes, and they find they need to have an accommodation. So Rico's manager asks for medical documentation that explains why that accommodation is needed, and then she reviews the schedule to see what can be done to assist Rico. And documenting a disability, documentation comes from the appropriate medical professional. The EEOC is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they are the enforcing agency of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And they say that the employer can expect to have the medical documentation from the appropriate medical professional. It could be a doctor. If it's a mental health impairment, it could be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, a nurse or physician's assistant, occupational or physical therapist. If there are any kind of occupational injuries or anything, speech therapists, vocational rehabilitation professionals, licensed mental health professionals, and educational professionals. Now, for a lot of people who are neurodiverse, people who have autism, people with ADHD, they may have that documentation that comes from a psychologist because they may have had an educational psychological report done. It's a big report. It takes a couple of days to do the testing. So you're not really just going to be able to go to your doctor and say, hey, I think I have autism. Can you write me a note? That'll be something that has been diagnosed, and you'll have documentation that went with that. So let's talk about some accommodations for hiring for people who are neurodiverse. Fewer interviewers can help the interviewee with social skills deficits and social anxiety feel more comfortable. Imagine sitting across the table from 4 or 5 people getting ready to interview you. They're going to scrutinize you. Maybe you have experienced this, and it could certainly cause anxiety and inhibit the applicant from best representing him or herself in an interview. And that's what the employer wants. The employer in an interview really wants to see the best of the person so they can determine if the person's right for the job. A demonstration of actual job skills may be more appropriate than using the typical interview questions to evaluate a candidate. I talked one time at a conference, I talked to a guy who was a cameraman, and he said, you know, if I could have shown them my camera skills, it would have been so much easier than sitting and answering some of those questions that really didn't seem to have much of anything to do with the actual job that I do or my skills. Questions provided in advance can help the candidate with social skills difficulties. You know, sometimes thinking on your feet can be difficult for many people, especially in a stressful situation. And if you have the questions ahead of time, if you're a little bit more familiar with them, it's going to put you at ease in that situation when you have to answer those questions. An instruction sheet or card may be helpful to remind the interviewee what he does and doesn't want to say, particularly when asked about himself. I talked to a guy years ago, and I will just not forget this. He was a great guy, and he was a computer programmer, and he loved computer languages. And he said, I need help because when I go for an interview, and they ask me about, tell me about yourself. He said, I go on and on and on about all this computer stuff, and they don't want to hear that much. I see their face just, kind of cloud over. And so we talked about maybe putting some things on a card. You can have a folder with you. You can pull a card out. You could have main points on there, things you want to talk about yourself and no more, to kind of help limit yourself so you don't overdo it and seem overzealous. A job coach or a parent as a support can help ease the tension and nervousness that a candidate may feel in a new situation with unfamiliar people and allow him to be more of himself. And then lastly, an informational interview first, conducted by phone might be helpful for some people to eliminate face-to-face contact. And it may be, it gives both parties a chance to determine interest and qualifications before an in-person interview takes place. And by that point, you've got that one step behind you. You might feel more confident and a little more at ease. So in this situation, we have a job applicant for a position in a prison working directly with the inmates, ask for an accommodation of having the interview questions sent to him so he could submit the answers in writing in lieu of participating in an interview. Well, because the applicant will be working directly with inmates in a counseling position, the employer required the applicant to be interviewed in person so his skills could be adequately evaluated. Accommodations that were provided in the form of a 2-person interview panel instead of 3. Questions were provided an hour ahead of time, an hour before the interview. Due to security reasons, they couldn't be sent out ahead of time. But the applicant was given an hour. Come in early, we'll give you the questions, you can sit down, you can think about those, and we'll put one less person in there to help ease the tension. But if it's a job-related skill, then the employer needs to evaluate that, and they don't have to remove that from the interview. Okay, now we're going to talk about performance and conduct standards. Under the ADA, employers can expect the same performance and conduct from an employee with a disability as they do all employees. They can hold all employees to the same standards. The only difference is they need to accommodate somebody with a disability to help them meet that standard. They don't have to reduce a performance standard. They don't have to reduce productivity. And they don't have to allow conduct issues to pop up from someone with a disability that they wouldn't allow from someone else. And so it's really important to disclose a disability and ask for accommodations when you first see performance and conduct issues arising, so that the employer knows that's the issue and they can work with you through that interactive process to put accommodations in place that can help you meet those standards. We get a lot of questions about, well, what do we do if we think somebody has a disability, but they've not disclosed that, but they're having performance problems? And we say, bring those performance problems or conduct problems to their attention. They may not be aware of it, or maybe they're waiting for the employer to bring it to their attention. And then that gives them the opportunity to disclose and say, yeah, I am having some performance issues. I'm having some difficulty with concentration in this big area with a lot of distractions, and I think I need some help. And that way, then the employer's aware of what's going on and can put things in place before it's too late. So here we have an IT or information technology consultant who is very skilled at finding solutions to problems, but he had difficulty with organization and remembering multiple tasks and information that he gained in meetings. So he was given an advanced organizer that would help him obtain information from the meeting in a more organized and meaningful way. He was permitted to record meetings so that he could go back over the information he may have missed. And his supervisor also agreed to send information and tasks and assignments through email. An advanced organizer is just something that you make up. I talk about this a lot. It can be very personalized to what each person may need. You can put as much information on this organizer as possible, and you may need different ones for different meetings. So when you go into a meeting, you have a lot of stuff written down and you only have to take brief notes. And that way you can pay more attention in a meeting and not have to write down as much. It takes a lot of thinking to take notes, listen to what's coming up next, write that down. And having the ability to record meetings can be very helpful too, because you can always go back and listen again if you need to. So here we have, this is really one of my favorite examples. Jameson was hired into a position where he excelled, but he was uneasy in the essential function of providing information to his team in a live presentation, followed by a question and answer session. He had to get up in a boardroom with people sitting around staring at him and present information. And he's like, I can't do that. So he asked if he could be allowed to video himself making the presentation. They watch the presentation with him in the room, and then he can take the questions live afterwards. I talked to the employer, and the employer was like, we're not really sure. And I said, well, why not give it a try and see how it works? Because it could really work for him. He's in the room, he's going to answer the questions live. And so the employer agreed to a trial period, and it worked really well. And he was able to video the presentation without the anxiety of a live audience. He struggled a bit with the live question and answer period at first, but then he became more proficient and at ease, and he became a lot more confident. And they continued to allow him to video the presentation instead of doing it live. So here we have JJ. He had difficulty handling change in the workplace, and he punched his arm through a wall several times when he hadn't been warned ahead of time that adjustments would need to be made. He asked for written notification of changes at least 24 hours in advance, all changes. That's what he asked the employer. And his employer agreed to provide advance notice of change in writing when possible, but also worked with him to help him modify his reactions when he needed to transition quickly to a new task. You know, depending on the environment, there may not be 24 hours notice that something is going to change. And so we all need to learn how to, react better when change is coming on. That's something we talk about a lot at Jan. People do need to know change as early as possible, how it's going to affect them, how it's going to affect their department, what it's going to look like. But sometimes it's not possible to know way ahead of time. And so we have to sometimes adjust how we respond to that. So now we're going to look at different accommodation options. So we're looking at purchasing or modifying equipment or products, and a couple there on the screen, a task light. Overhead lighting can be very bothersome for some people. Fluorescent lighting is not good for some people. It ticks, it makes like, it goes through a cycle, and people can hear that, and it can really bother them. There's a watch that can be set with timers, a recorder, a headset. That is not a wireless headset, but a wireless headset can be particularly helpful for somebody who can get up and move around. If they're on the phone a lot, maybe they do a customer service position and they're typing. And then an iPad with apps, that can be very helpful too. There's so many apps out there now that you can certainly find one to help in most situations. So Joni is an administrative assistant whose essential functions include taking and disseminating notes from various meetings. She had difficulty listening, remembering what to write, and then keeping up with what was being said next. And I mentioned that earlier with the advanced organizer. It takes a lot of executive functioning to be able to take and record good notes. So Joni was provided with a smart pen that records the meetings as she takes brief notes. This accommodation enables her to focus on what's being presented in the meetings at the same time getting down the important information. And to me, I just call it the magic pen rather than the smart pen. You have to have specific paper for it to work, but you write and it records. And then you can go back and you can write, that your boss is saying 3 things I want you to remember. You write number 1 and a word or 2 when your boss is saying whatever. Number 2, when they're saying the second point. And then you can go back to that, tap on number 1, and the pen will tell you, because it recorded what was said, it will tell you what was said at that time. And that can be very helpful for a lot of people. Okay, and here we're going to talk about making the work site accessible. Employers are tasked with making the work site accessible, usually when they get a request from somebody who needs more help. We have a sign there on the slide. There's a sign for parking. Some people need to be able to park really close to the building. There's the one picture shows doors, like an automatic door opener for people who have difficulty opening traditional doors. And then that bottom picture is a threshold ramp. And that's helpful for people who use a walker, a rollator, a wheelchair, maybe a cane, or just have difficulty picking up their feet. Can be helpful for anyone. I worked in a building one time. It was an old school. Oh my gosh, it had all kinds of different levels of floors and concrete and then wood and big door steps to walk over. And it was a hazard. And so something like that can be really helpful for all people. And, you know, we usually think about the physical aspects, but we can also think about how the workplace affects people who are neurodiverse. And I mentioned a couple things earlier, you know, like people who have difficulty with sensory processing can experience oversensitivity to touch, sights, too bright of lights, sounds, you know, too distracting sounds. I mentioned the lights earlier. Fluorescent lights can bother somebody, maybe. Smells in the workplace. So, you know, many of us encounter those things and it doesn't bother us and we don't think about it, but those can be really bothersome for certain people. So here we have a lab employee who's very sensitive to smells, who used a certain scent, primarily available in shampoo and body lotion, to calm herself down when the effects of the workplace overwhelmed her. So with a newly instigated fragrance-free workplace policy, the employee was at a loss about what to do. And a lot of employers were finding are instituting policies fragrance-free. When we were in our building, a lot of us are working from home now. We're not in the building as much. We still have that policy, but we had a fragrance-free policy because we had people with asthma. We had people with fragrance sensitivities, and it can be very difficult for them to work with lots of different fragrances, cleaning products and all. And so this employee used scent and shampoo and body lotion to help. And so Jan Consultants suggested an aromatherapy necklace or bracelet that would allow her access to the scent when needed, but would not be an irritation to others. Flavored gum and hard candy were also recommended. That necklace has a little portion and the bracelet that holds the scent, and then it has a little place you open, you know, and you could maybe open that up, go someplace a little bit more private and sniff that, and that could be helpful. So here we have a parts sorter in a distribution center who had difficulty standing for his shift with only a 30-minute lunch and a short afternoon break. His work became sloppy in the afternoons due to his fatigue. And so the employee was provided with both an anti-fatigue mat, which is a thick mat that you can stand on that really helps your legs and your back, and also a stand lean stool that allowed him the ability to work in an upright position while his weight rested on the padded seat. That can be very helpful for people who do need to have the appearance of standing up. Some places, salespeople, the employer says, well, you need to be standing. Okay, but this stool can really help because you're sitting on it at a height that looks like you're standing, but it takes the weight off of your feet and legs. So job restructuring is another type of an accommodation. Employers don't have to take away essential functions, but they can look at how those functions are done or when those functions are done. They can remove marginal functions, move those around, redistribute those. So let's look at an example here. Here's an employer that required all employees work a rotating schedule, which included time at a customer service window. Becker, an employee with autism, asked to be excused from the window duty because of difficulty interacting with strangers. And we see this a lot. People will take jobs as customer service representatives, and then they discover how hard it is to talk on the phone to strangers, particularly strangers that may be calling with problems, or working at a window, working with the public. And so the employer denied Becker's request, stating that rotating to all the positions is an essential function. But the process doesn't stop there. The employer can't just deny an accommodation and say, oh, too bad, we're not doing that. What they really need to do is look at, okay, we can't remove that function from your job, but let's talk about how we can make it easier for you to do that function. And that could be different things, perhaps looking at when he works that window. Let's not put him in that window when it's the busiest. Let's put him in that window. Let's do his rotation in the morning or late afternoon or whenever times aren't as busy. Let's let him work with a mentor who's really good with customers and can kind of show him how to do this. Here's how I do it. Here's what I say. Here's kind of how I interact. And that could be helpful. So modifying a schedule and allowing leave time. That's one of the most common accommodations we see on our team as well. Modifying a schedule can mean about anything that works for an employee that also works for the employer and doesn't create a hardship. That can mean adjusting the starting times or the ending times. It can mean changing a break schedule. It can mean taking all your breaks and your lunch together so you have a long break at lunchtime to lie down and take a nap or to go out and do exercises. It could mean working 4 10-hour days so you have a day off, so you're not working 5 days. It could mean reducing your hours, so you're working 6 hours a day, 5 days instead of 8 hours a day. And then allowing leave time. A leave can be a really effective accommodation if it's needed. And some employers don't understand that because they think, okay, accommodations are to help a person work. You're talking about leave. You're not going to be here. So how's that going to be helpful? But leave as an accommodation can really help people get treatment, help them recuperate so that they can get back to work. It can be an hour a week for a counseling appointment, several hours a week. It could mean a day a month, day or two a month when my stress level's exacerbated. I just need to have a day off. Or it could be for longer periods of time, chunks of time, 2 weeks, 3 months. Somebody needs treatment. It can be whatever the employee needs. Again, as long as it doesn't create a hardship. Excuse me. Okay, so here we have Nigel. Nigel is a case manager who had difficulty getting his required documentation completed. He's a social worker. He works in a cubicle in a noisy open area, and it limits his ability to focus and concentrate. With no private space available, he feels a change in office hours may help. He can't get his own office where he can shut the door and it's quiet. So he's thinking about changing his hours. So his supervisor agreed that the office is hectic when staffed. So she approved the schedule change of working 2 hours early, not only before his coworkers arrived, but also when he had the most mental acuity and ability to focus. And that's important too. Lots of people work better at certain times. Some people are morning people, some people are absolutely not, and they're better in the afternoon. And you can look at doing those difficult things, harder tasks, when you're feeling better, when you have the most energy or the most ability to focus. Modifying policies. Now, what this means is that an employer can modify a policy for someone with a disability that they don't change for others. It can be a policy that says no animals in the workplace. Well, somebody needs to bring their service animal or their emotional support animal. The employer can change that policy. It could be a uniform policy. Somebody has really bad sensitivity to certain types of clothing. I can't wear this uniform shirt. I just can't do it. And the employer can look at, okay, we'll modify the policy. You don't have to wear this shirt. Let's find you one that's similar that you can wear. So here we have a couple examples. Here, Leah becomes overly stressed when asked questions by her coworkers that she felt pressured to answer. She often reacted with anger, usually slamming her fist on her desk and shouting for others to leave her alone. Not a good thing. So after she was pulled into a second disciplinary meeting with her supervisor, she disclosed and asked for assistance in handling her stress levels at work. And we would suggest you don't wait till it gets to the second disciplinary meeting. But sometimes people just really aren't aware of how bad things are. So the employer instated a new policy for handling the questions. Instead of coworkers coming to her cubicle to ask her questions, they would be required to email her. She would then respond with an answer or a reply that she needed more time. This greatly reduced her feelings of being overwhelmed and enabled her to respond to her coworkers more appropriately. And the bonus is then the employer had a record of those requests coming in. How many requests are we having? What are those requests? What's the time frame of getting that answer back out? And so the employer felt by accommodating this person to help them was really helping all of them, because now they had documentation of their issues, what the problems were that the people needed solved. So providing readers, interpreters, and coaches. Readers are provided for people who have difficulty with written materials, or maybe testing anxiety, where they just might not be able to get read in a situation. It's usually in a testing situation. And a reader is somebody who assists with reading. They don't interpret, they don't restate the question, they don't answer. They just read the information for the person to listen to, and that can be extremely helpful. Interpreters for people who are deaf may be needed for meetings and certain activities in the workplace. It's up to the employer to determine how often an interpreter would be there based on cost, and there are other accommodations that might work. And then coaches. Some people find a coach to be very helpful when they're in a new position to help learn that position, or maybe they're in a position they know, but they've gotten new job duties and they're having difficulty with those duties. So here we have an example. James was a library employee who was very verbal and unnecessarily loud when speaking throughout the day. The head librarian spoke to James about his voice level, but he was unable to modulate it. So he worked with his job coach to find an app that could help him practice modulating his voice for the appropriate level for working indoors at a library. Reassignment. Now it's often considered the accommodation of last resort, but it doesn't have to be if the employer and the employee both agree. How this usually works is when somebody can no longer be accommodated in the position that they're in, or the accommodations that they need would cause a hardship or would require the removal of essential functions, then the employer looks for an open position that the employee's qualified for. They don't have to create a position. They don't have to bump someone else out of their position. They look for what's open that the person's qualified for. So here we have a production line worker who asked for extra breaks as needed to help manage anxiety, but with no advance warning or set schedule for the breaks, the employer could not allow the production line to shut down every time the employee needed to walk away. So after meeting with his supervisor, it was determined that the employee would be better suited to a job in maintenance, where he would have the ability to take breaks as needed without causing a disruption to production. So here we have some accommodations for advancing neurodivergent employees. Mentoring. We can remember Brody and the training and support that he received to help him adjust his inappropriate eye contact. A mentor can also help navigate the unseen rules and politics of a workplace. There's a lot of things when you come into a workplace that you pick up on. Sometimes people with disabilities aren't able to pick up on those. They don't really see those, and they might need help navigating. A support animal. A move to a new position may cause initial anxiety that a support person could help assist with. Job restructuring. I think we talked about that, but many marginal functions could be removed from a position while an employee new to that position is able to learn the essential functions more effectively. Then the marginal functions are kind of added back in. Modifying policies. Remember the example of Nigel and his alternative office hours. That simple change in the normal business hours eliminated the distractions of a busy and often hectic office for Nigel, and the policy modification aided him greatly in his ability to excel in his position. Working remotely, we're finding that's a really big accommodation. Everybody wants to telework. Everybody wants to continue to, not everybody, large portions of people that have been teleworking because of the pandemic want to continue. It's been really effective for them. It's helped them manage a lot of their difficulties. Sometimes they didn't realize how helpful it could be to telework, where you can be at home, you can manage your own environment for most people. Now, we've talked to a lot of people that it wasn't as successful. They weren't able to manage their symptoms. I talked to a man who was at home and he said, I've got to go back to work. We're all sitting at the kitchen table. My wife is doing her job. I'm doing my job, and my two kids are doing their schoolwork. And it's too distracting for me. I can't do it. But remote work can be helpful for a lot of people because they can control their environment a little bit better than they can in the workplace. And even in a job where it's not customary to work from home, a trial period can be used to see if it's going to be successful. There are lots of jobs that can't be performed at home, and there are jobs that can't be performed from home at 100%. But maybe a couple days a week or part-time could be very helpful. EAPs, or employee assistance programs, can be very helpful and offer many advantages for employees, including referrals for vital support services like therapy and other medical needs. To ensure continuous feedback from a manager, employees can benefit from feedback and assistance in order to stay on track when they're progressing through employment with new and unfamiliar tasks, with new assignments. And then last there, ensure opportunities to participate in training. Remember Pete, who needed an alternate form of training. He was unable to meet in a big group, but he was successful when he got the information in a small group setting or individualized setting. And so we need to make sure that we ensure opportunities for people to participate, but consider what each person needs to be able to be effective in that training. Not everybody needs the same thing. And so that's why accommodations are made on a case-by-case basis. All right. Do we have any questions?
We definitely have at least two.
Okay.
And very interesting ones too. Marcus and Kathleen, would you like to ask your questions, or I'd be happy to ask them for you if you prefer? I'll just go ahead and go. So Marcus mentioned that, let me see, I need to head out, but thank you for the talk. Tali says, thank you. It was more of a, Marcus had more of a statement mentioning that it's difficult and sometimes cost prohibitive to get a diagnosis for autism, and et cetera. And a lot of folks, as a result, don't get the diagnosis they need because of that. What are the most cost-effective ways to get a diagnosis for autism, ADHD, or other forms of neurodiversity?
Okay, what we would say is vocational rehabilitation services. You can become a client of vocational rehabilitation, and that is free of charge to you. Each state in the United States has its own office, but then there are multiple offices in different cities. It seems like different states provide different levels of benefits, but they can do evaluations and they can do assessments and they can pay for those. And so you need to become a client of that, but again, it's free. But they can also provide you with training, funding for college courses or professional training. They can provide job coaches, different maybe computers, assistive technology. They have funding to pay for that. And they can also help pay for other services. Maybe if somebody needs some mental health services, therapy, or something like that, they can help pay for that. That's one thing to do. And we have a list of those on our website, state by state. Another thing is to look at a university that has a doctoral psychology program, because psychologists who are going through training are required to do the testing that you would go and pay for. But because they're training, they can do that for you at a lot lower cost, and it's usually done on a sliding scale. Now, they're supervised by licensed psychologists, so it's on the up and up, and it's accurate information. It's just that it's done through a practicing student, doctoral student. So that is something else. You know, and I was sure that was the way it was done. And so we work, our offices, our JAN is administered through West Virginia University. And so I called the doctoral psychology department at our university and asked them. And they said, absolutely, that's what we do. You just call and we'll talk and we can set up an appointment. And then they look at how to charge on a sliding scale that is much, much less expensive than if you went to a licensed psychologist. So those would be the two ways I would recommend.
There's another question by Kathleen, which you answered, but just to double check that, all points are covered.
Sure.
Are employers required to make accommodations once the disability is disclosed? Also, does there need to be a number of options offered before the employer can take action to let go of the employee?
Okay, that's a good question. Yes, employers are obligated to provide accommodations that don't cause a hardship. And that means that something would be too expensive, would be too disruptive, or would change the nature of the business. Now, like in that example about one of the last examples, reassignment, the person needed to take breaks for stress, and he worked in a production line. And the employer says, we can't do that. We can't shut the production line down every time you need to take a break because it was multiple times during the day. So they look at a reassignment, they found one that worked. So that would be a hardship to shut that production line down. But yes, the employer needs to look at other options. If they can't provide what the employee, excuse me, has asked for, the process should not stop. The process should continue to look at alternate accommodations. And that's where Jan can come in, because sometimes we can, talk to people and get more information about the situation, and we can offer some alternate ideas that maybe people haven't thought of. An employer, under the ADA, employer needs to show that an employee cannot do the job even with accommodations. And that doesn't mean, okay, we're going to give you this one accommodation, and if that doesn't work, you're being terminated. It means multiple accommodations, and over time too, to see if this will work. And if this doesn't work, then maybe we need to tweak it. And so it's not just one or two accommodations for a week or two, and that doesn't work. It needs to be over time, and it needs to be a variety of accommodations. And that's, again, I'm not pushing Jan, but I do work for Jan. It's a free service, and we can be very helpful if there are issues with, we're out of ideas, we're not sure what to do. We might be able to help with that.
Beautiful. One more question that received a +1. How would you handle a situation where the disability and request for accommodation was not disclosed until after notice of termination?
Okay, well, I keep saying under the ADA, EEOC is the enforcing agency, and what they say is if the person has been terminated, getting ready to be terminated, the employer's made that decision, they don't have to go back and change that decision. They don't have to excuse any kind of performance issues or behavior that occurred before they knew there was a disability. Now, some employers will say, okay, let's back up here a little bit. So if somebody didn't do that, I would say go ahead and do it, because it could be an opportunity for the employer to make a change. But that's why it's so important moving forward and looking at your own situation is not to wait too late, because the employer doesn't have to go back and say, oh, well, we excuse all of that because we didn't know you had a disability. With it being the employee's responsibility to tell the employer, we suggest doing that as soon as possible when there are any difficulties that the employee knows about, or if the employer comes to them and says, hey, we've noticed, you're not getting this done, or you're not getting that done on time. Let's talk about that. That's probably a good time to disclose. But I would say there's always a chance the employer could change its mind. So you could always disclose and say, hey, I didn't know the right time to do it, or I was afraid to do it, or, I didn't know. And sometimes it's true. People don't know how much their disabilities affecting their job performance till their employer says so, and sometimes the employer, though, will tell them, have several different meetings. And if that's the case, the person needs to disclose, during those meetings, not wait till it's too late.
Beautiful. I'm going to pause right now and ask if anyone wants to ask a question.
So I have a question. What if you have taken the proper procedures for your disability and you disclosed it? However, you then find out in the aftermath, if you're terminated, that you actually had the wrong diagnosis. So therefore having the wrong medication or treatment and weren't able to properly function as you should at your optimal level?
Well, that's probably more of a legal question that I can't answer. But if the employer acted in good faith, you know, and looked at the medical documentation that was provided and worked with the accommodations that were requested and they weren't helpful, then the employers probably, and again, I was a special ed teacher before I came to Jan. I'm certainly not qualified to give legal advice, and that's not what we do. But the employer may not be held responsible for that because they if they worked on a good faith effort, we took the information, we did the best we could, and the employee still wasn't able to do the work. And that's it's a shame when that happens. A lot of people I find out, you know, on my team, a lot of people get the wrong diagnosis, or it takes a long time to get a proper diagnosis. And so they don't know what to tell their employer, or they don't have the information to back up what they're saying to the employer. And it can cause problems.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Realize you're over time. Would you be open to have one more question coming from Anthony, who's sitting outside, so he can't speak much, but he typed his question or typed his
Sure.
comment?
Yeah, I'm fine with it. If you're okay with it, sure.
Absolutely. So Anthony says, I had a remote opportunity in a help desk role that I was really intimidated in and ultimately resigned from because there were so many moving parts to it. I wonder if this was a form of disability in addition to what I already know I have, and if any accommodations could have been made. I have previously proven to be tech savvy and able to multitask, but I found an inability to use that many applications and tools. I'm in horrible financial hardships now because of this.
Well, if you have a disability, there can be, how do I say this? There can be different issues or limitations. That's the language of the ADA, limitations, and that's why I bring that up. You know, you may be able to excel in certain jobs, and then you get a job where, because there's so many moving parts, it's difficult for you because of executive functioning issues, distractibility, memory, you know, lots of different things that might cause issues with that type of a job. There could have been accommodations, possibly. There could have been more training. There could have been possibly training in certain areas. Like, let's get you proficient in this area before we add this other application to it. You know what I mean? Like, train you in areas separate so you're not doing all of that at one time. An employer might be able to look at that. Provide extended training, provides a mentor, somebody who could sit with you. Now, they don't have to pay two people to do one job, but they could allow somebody to kind of sit with you and shadow you. You shadow them to see how they get the work done, and they shadow you to help see where your issues are, what your problems are, and then they can help maybe give you tips or point you in the right direction. But I think we see a lot of times where people are proficient and fine in one area, and then they get a promotion or they get another job, and it just brings on issues because tasks that they're not proficient in, or tasks that they haven't done before, or it's too many tasks all at once to learn. So yes, there could have been accommodations made for that, absolutely.